Hello and welcome to the NVR Podcast number 18. I'm Rachael Aylmer.
And I'm Peter Jakob.
And today we're talking about Don't Talk About Violence, ? As a brilliant topic and our preamble before the recording, it'd be really nice, Peter, for an intro. How do we get to this topic?
Well, apparently after a recent webinar, a number of professionals expressed concern about our use of the term violent in relation to certain behaviors of young people, and said that we should not call it violence. So I don't know more of that feedback yet, but I just thought it's an interesting thing to look at. What does it mean when we use the word violence? What does it mean to different people? What does it mean in context? How do we operate with that term? So that's what I felt would be an interesting topic.
Yeah, and I think it comes up a lot in our training, in our foundation level training. Mm-hmm. There are occasionally some of the participants feel there's some discomfort about that word, and sometimes in sessions with families, I've experienced some discomfort with using the word violence, or not connecting to the work that we do in NVR. Why do we call it non-violent resistance?
Yeah, I think those concerns were around use of the word violence in pertaining to certain child behaviors. I mean, you've already mentioned discomfort among people on training courses, on professional training courses, and among some parents. And I'm curious about your experience. Do you feel that discomfort is shared by the majority of parents or only by some? And can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think in my experience, some, not all. I think at the start of start working with clients, that having these healthy discussions about talking about violence, I think it becomes quite clear that they are victims of violence from their child, from their adolescent, young person. And majority of families, it sits well with. They recognise that the behaviours presented are violent, the language presented is violent, the damage to the property is violent, and most parents can connect with that. Just a few, just some don't. And actually, sometimes that then opens up further conversations around the parents' distress of how they perhaps have normalised some of this violence.
So, and we are using the word violence in our conversation right now, but I'm really curious, the parents who are uncomfortable with the use of that word, what causes their discomfort?
I think it's about thinking perhaps of their child's distress, not wanting to connect that distress or trauma experiences to violence, seeing the distressed child as a non-violent child, even though there are violent behaviours. I think I've not deeply explored it with families, but perhaps coming from a very child-centred position, thinking it's hard to imagine, the child that you've raised to not be able to regulate themselves and become so distressed and violent towards the parents. There's fear of criminalising them. I think there's many of things that...
Many different motives to feel uncomfortable with the use of the word violence. So one that you've said is the belief that it must be distress that is causing a particular violent incident, or indeed every violent incident, and that distress is inevitably caused by trauma. I guess what strikes me is that while we know that children with high adverse childhood experiences, prior to coming into their adoptive families or into their foster families or into their residential homes, or prior to perhaps, if they're still in the family of origin, prior to a violent offender, partner, or the mother or husband, leaving the family, are much more likely to become violent. And I guess then it's easy to believe that every single incident of violence must be on account of the child's traumatic response being triggered off, a fight response being triggered off. And I even often struggle with the use of the term trigger. I mean, the correct psychological term is a stimulus, something that could stimulate a response. A trigger is a very different metaphor. You have a trigger on a gun. Once you pull the trigger, then the bullet comes out no matter what. Whereas stimulus is a very different term. Stimulus creates an inclination to act in a certain way. But it does not mean that action, that particular action, is inevitable. Okay, but that aside, that's the trigger metaphor. But this belief that every response must necessarily be a traumatic response, a fight response by a child, and that child actually must be experiencing distress. And it's a good question, isn't it? Is that the case? But even if that were the case, and I don't believe it is the case, I think the propensity to act aggressively, of course, is much greater in children or young people who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, who've had adverse childhood experiences. Even if that were the case, what would it mean if we use the term violence? And you've mentioned that other aspect, the worry about stigmatizing their child. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I think everybody comes to their sessions with a different background mindset, and parents, it's hard to imagine that their child can present behaviours that are very, very harmful, very, very threatening, very, very dangerous. Unlike, that like an adult can present. And when adults present this level of aggression and violence, it's very common that we would call the police, and that the police are called when there is adult to adult aggression and violence. And so when a parent witnesses such levels of aggression and harm and harmful behaviour, that inevitably the police would need to be called, therefore criminalising their child or fear of.
Which is interesting, because I'm thinking of a residential service for children that works with NVR, in which every member of staff is trained in NVR, and they have been able to reduce the criminalization of young people to almost zero.
Mm.
You know,
How so? How so? How have they managed that? I think that would be a question that people listening would really want to know.
by working with NVR and calling out certain behaviors as violent. And I think that it's an incredibly important piece of evidence, so to speak, that rather than criminalizing the young people, they have reversed the trend. You know, they feel they no longer need to criminalize them because the rates of violence have gone down so much. And also the restraint, the need to restrain. I mean, the members of staff are all trained in restraint. The restraint went down by about 90%. So I think, and the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, isn't it? So if there's an assumption that by calling certain aggressive behaviors violence, you were to criminalize the child, actually, we see the opposite of that. But I was wondering about another thing. I was wondering about the word is. So is there a concern that when we use the term violence, we are saying this young person is violent, which is not what we do in NVR. In NVR, we say this young person, and I'm choosing the tense very carefully that I'm using right now, has acted with violence. And the response of the parent and the community around the parents, the growing network of support, is a particular and very clear message to the young person: this violence must stop now. And I think implicit in that message is a certain belief. And that belief is that the young person can respond to whatever troubles them, may trouble them, in other ways. They do not need to respond in this way. And I think if I'm worried that if I use the term violence, I characterize the young person as being violent, I, so to speak, treat the violence as a character trait of the young person. And I think that goes down to a belief in the inevitability of the young person. So because they have been traumatized, they cannot but act in this particular way. They cannot help it. They are, so to speak, victims of their past trauma. And I think there's a risk there. And the risk is that I communicate to the child that I do not believe they can change their behavior now. And, you know, I'm thinking of Carol Dweck's theory of growth, you know? And according to her research, we know that when people believe traits can change in themselves or in others, and when people communicate to the other person their belief that that trait can change or that behavior pattern, then it's likely to change. If, however, they communicate that they believe it is an immutable trait, it is a fixed trait, then it is less likely to change. So I think if I think, right, you have shown a violent behavior, this violence must stop now. And if I can develop that belief, that strong belief inside of myself, I'm likely to communicate that faith in the child to the child. actually the message is not you are a violent person. The message is you are not a violent person. You are a good person. And that's why the violence must stop now. And I think that is what accounts for the success in NVR in actually reducing violence.
I totally get with that. I think using that word inevitable, I think also alongside that inevitable thinking by some parents is some of the language and terminology used to describe a violent young person. And one of those I suppose a title that they're given is the perpetrator, which infuriates me when people regard to young people as perpetrators. And we in our practice refer to our child in the work we're doing as our focused child. And that's how we refer to them. But I think it's the language across the board. Just going right back earlier, Peter, to the metaphor of trigger. And I was thinking about, that term is used and it's commonly used in our work and by parents and by other professionals. And it's what people can make a connection to. But part of me feels that metaphor you used about a gun, that in itself is violence, isn't it? So using that metaphor trigger, like you would trigger a gun is violence. And I think, that language around perpetrators, language around connection before correction, all of that language, correction, triggers, perpetrators, is all very negative and harmful language.
Well, let's imagine, Rachel, you were an angry young person who has been prone to act with aggression. And the kind of aggression has become violent. So let's imagine that you have hit me, okay? Or that you've threatened me with a knife. Incidentally, I went back